Let's start with something so obvious, because I want to convince you tonight that it was possible to be an ordinary citizen in Nazi Germany and to feel that it was respectable and even patriotic to persecute Jews. How is that possible? Isn't it obvious? There's the golden rule. There's Kant's categorical imperative. I've been told, I'm not the expert on this, but I've been told every culture in the world has a motto that says, treat other people the way you would expect them to treat you. The Hippocratic Oath says, first, do no harm. This is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in the United Nations, December 1948. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. That standard of ethical behavior remained intact during the 12 years of Nazi rule. What changed was the definition of other. We should act to one another. Over the period of 33 to 39, Germans were subjected to not just, we look back, we say ideology, propaganda. That's way too simple. They learned new facts about human nature. Their knowledge was changed in such a way that people who were considered racially unworthy or unwanted were pushed off the screen of the moral, well, philosophers call it the universe of moral responsibility. So how did that happen? I'm going to divide my remarks tonight into three periods. The first few months, maybe year of Nazi power, 1933 to 34. And then most of my talk will be from the years from 1933 to 39. And then I'll quickly close with the war years. Now, these years are often overlooked because they're overshadowed literally by the horror that came afterwards. But I'm going to talk only tonight about Germans living in Germany, living in a regime that they felt was legitimate, and to look at the Holocaust from the inside out, as Germans at the time might have looked at it. This is an unusual way of looking at the Holocaust, especially in a Holocaust commemoration service, such as lecture such as this. It makes sense to look at the Holocaust from the standpoint of the victims, the almost 6 million Jews who were killed, the 14 million Poles, Soviet POWs, the disabled, the asocial, the homosexual, etc. It seems only decent to start the Holocaust by looking at the victims and keeping our center there. For many, many years after 1945, the common sense interpretation of why the Holocaust happened was one of two answers. First, a few very fanatical leaders close to Hitler were possessed with the idea of anti-Semitism, and they started it. And then a very minority of rotten apples, sadists, sick people in the concentration camp were responsible for the worst horrors. And the people who didn't agree with that approach said, no, 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 that's wrong. We should understand sociology and understand what makes people in groups behave the way they do. And when you look at that, people look like they're just cogs in a wheel, they obey mindlessly. Well, that's not, I don't think, how it happened. And the latest research suggests something very different, and that is that people believed what they were doing was right. Unpleasant, terrible maybe, but necessary. And it's true, Nazi Germany was a dictatorship. But in 1933, Hitler took over without violence, and he had at his command all of the institutions that were put in place to protect democracy, turned against them. That means a literate, completely literate population, advanced media, just think of it at the time. I remember my father said, you just can't imagine what happened. Grandpa came into the farmhouse and he plugged this box in the wall and a voice came out. I said, you can't imagine how surprising that was. And during that same 5 or 6 year period, people saw their first movies. Under Hitler, they saw their first talking movies. The first party to use electronic amplification, without which you couldn't hear me now, even though I do speak loudly, was the Nazi Party. How else could thousands and thousands of people be gotten together? The Nazi Party was technologically very, very adept, and they used the media developed in the democracies to advance their aims. So, okay, let's ask some basic questions. Whoops, I'm just getting myself used to the keyboard. That's my problem. If I stand close enough so that you can hear me, I can't see the keyboard. Oh wait, but I think, This is a very high-tech place. I think this is going to change the slide. Yes. Oh, and then, okay. Now we are going to, it's easy for us to think of the Nazis as a long ago, far away place, and I just want to play you a small clip of Hitler as we usually remember him. Okay, it's really hard to know where to stop because he talks so in such very long sentences. Hold on, let me go. PowerPoint, okay. All right. Okay. That's the leader we think of. We think of Hitler and Nazi Germany as being completely different from us. No leader would talk this way again. No leader ever has talked, not even Mussolini talked like that. The future of Germany is me. I am the way. He's speaking like a preacher. And the whole style is something that we don't identify with. And that's easy. That makes it easy for us to say, oh, if we were in Germany, we would not be taken in. We would. Little background. This is the first quick section. First of all, who voted for the Nazis? Take a look at this. 1932, the last free election. And the Nazis party is the red party. Oh, yeah, right. This too. Okay. These are the the Nazis are the brown party, of course. And these are the Marxist parties. The Marxist parties polled 37.3%. The Nazis polled 33.1%. In other words, the plurality was the left-wing parties, and this is what the Reichstag looked like, more or less, when Hitler took power. Hitler took power because he was appointed by the Chancellor, constitutionally. In other words, the German people did not elect the Nazi regime, but the people, the representatives in the Reichstag, who they elected, appointed Hitler Chancellor and gave him limited dictatorial powers. And so what happened, we figure is, or we, people who do statistics, saw these small parties coalesced gradually into the Nazi Party, and this was the core of the Nazis. So that within 1 year of Hitler's takeover, there's no question he had a majority of power, popularity, and by the late 1930s, he had what we would call off-the-charts approval ratings from everybody except people who were endangered because of their politics or their ethnicity. And notice, which party held its members consistently? Which party did not lose loyalty? The Catholic Party. Although when the vote came, the Catholic representatives voted Hitler power. So I just wanted to get that as a background. The other background question is, what percentage of the population do you think in Germany in 1933 was Jewish? Just take a guess. If you know, I'll ask you not to say. So what do you think the percentage of Jews was in the German population? Meanwhile, some of you sitting on the hard steps and violating the fire laws, there are still a couple seats up here in the front, if you want to come down. Okay, what percent? Who will take a guess? Just take a guess. Here, the man in the green? 8%. Yeah.
Well, half of 1%.
That's actually high. Usually when people don't know, they say 20%, 15%. The answer is less than 1% in 1933 and half of 1% by 1939. So you're right. That I just want to remind you how tiny the Jewish population was, how defenseless they were. Okay, so what happened? Hitler became chancellor. Nobody took him seriously. They said, oh my gosh, he looks like Charlie Chaplin. Listen to him talk. Listen to his accent, his Austrian accent. This man is not to be taken seriously. And he may not have been taken seriously except for the fact that on the 28th of February, terrorists attacked the country. They bombed, they set an incendiary bomb. They set the Reichstag, that's the equivalent of the Capitol building in Washington, on fire. Hitler used the opportunity to say there's a communist revolution, I need emergency powers, I need to arrest Marxists. He put his political enemies, so-called, in jail. He stood himself forward. He said, I am your defense against terrorism. He called a special election. There was another election, not a free election. This time, 43% of all Germans voted for the Nazi candidates. Still not a majority. They had a Reichstag debate, and he got power. But because he defended the country against the terrorist attack by communists. Now, turned out that not even the Nazi staffed court a few months later could convict the people they accused. It was trumped up charges, but it worked. And here I couldn't resist. Here's a cartoon from the British humor magazine Punch. Bismarck, Chancellor Bismarck, is saying, okay, buddy, this is your chance. Use terror. It always works. That's from Punch 1933. Okay. And immediately, and because this is because we're here and there's PowerPoint, let me take you into the world of visuals. In the newspapers, everywhere, Nazis were represented as being boots, law, order. Jews were being represented as, these people who quibble about constitutional rights. The professors especially, look at that professor looking for dust on the Nazis' boots. And look at the boot up here stamping on the snake of opposition. And the experts concluded also, not only, these are three famous ones who I devoted a chapter to, but men who had no previous association with Nazism, no public association with Nazism, spoke out vigorously and loudly. The educational establishment, who Germans respected, this is the land, after all, of poets and dreamers, thinkers and poets, Denker und Dichter. Their intellectuals told them to trust the new regime. All three of these men rushed to join the Nazi Party and did so within 3 months of Hitler's becoming chancellor. On the left is a man you don't hear about because he died he was ill and he died in 1947. But if he had lived, I think he would still remain the greatest historian of Christianity, probably in the West. But he died quite young after writing an encyclopedia of the history of the Old Testament and the Bible. So we don't know about him, but he was very famous as a theologian at the time. Carl Schmitt, Carl Schmitt, most or many political scientists still think was the great political theorist of the 20th century. Maybe Hannah Arendt was greater, but it's not. He's a brilliant, brilliant man. Completely swept away by Nazism and by anti-Semitism. And, of course, there's the case of Martin Heidegger, also maybe the greatest philosopher of the 20th century, the thinker without whom Jean-Paul Sartre could never have existed, etc. This is not my field, I don't know. What's important to me is that we understand that the average German heard the respected intellectuals, the leaders who they looked up to, without prior Nazi background, convert to Nazism. And this was also very important in making Nazism respectable, and specifically anti-Semitism. Kittel, the theologian, was always the leader in the amongst the Protestant theologians for opening up dialogue with the Jews. By 1933 in June, he published a little pamphlet saying why Jewish Christians should separate from Aryan Christians. He said Jews should have their own church, just like African Americans in the United States have their own version of Christianity. Nobody would expect the races to mix in Christianity. This from a man who had spoken the tolerance in the 1920s. Okay. Meanwhile, the Nazis were pretty clever. They had very sophisticated marketing techniques. They had booths everywhere. Now, everywhere there were pictures of strong, militarized Nazis in brown shirts. And their enemies were always derided and insulted as wimps and effeminate. For example, and all of the Nazi crimes against Jews were depicted as retaliatory because of something the Jews had done. And I'll just give you one example of this genre in The Boomerang. On April 1st, 1933, the Goebbels, not Hitler. Hitler didn't want anything to do with this, and actually after he became Chancellor, Hitler almost never mentioned the Jewish question in public because he sensed that this was not popular in Germany. Goebbels took the lead in anti-Semitism, so they declared a nationwide boycott against all Jewish businesses, professionals, doctors, scheduled for Saturday, April 1st, 1933. And they didn't declare it as an act against the Jews. No, they said they did it because a group of Jews in New York had threatened a boycott. So it was represented as the Jews in New York who started the boycott, and it boomeranged and it hurt the Jews in Nazi Germany. Now, in fact, the boycott failed. Many people went out of their way to demonstrate their allegiance to their Jewish storekeeper, their doctor, etc. And most of the SA men who were supposedly protecting the people from the shoppers from going in, mostly just got drunk and went brawling in the streets. So it looked like it was a victory for the anti-Nazis, but the Nazis turned it around and declared a national victory. One day later, they said, aha, we've won. They called off the boycott. So they also took a failure and they announced it as a success. Also typical. One of the first casualties was academic freedom. Once again, here's a cartoon. I think cartoons often allow us to read subtexts. Cartoonists have more freedom to be overt than people writing just texts. So here's humor. Professor Cohen, here's Professor Cohen, is speaking to an audience with gas masks to protect them from the evil ideas of Professor Cohen. The only professors in the audience who don't have gas masks are two other caricatures of Jews. So again, the enemy, the Jews, are ridiculed and pushed out of humanity. And I thought the gas masks from the First World War was just too eerie. The rule that went behind this is that in April of 1933, after the boycott failed, all public employees, all civil servants who had Jewish parents or were married to Jewish spouses, wives in most cases, lost their jobs. They had lifetime tenure, they were fired. That meant all university professors, all teachers at every level, all bureaucrats were fired. All lawyers, Jewish lawyers, were reduced to the percentage of Jews in the town that they practiced. So if 20% of all of Berlin's lawyers were Jewish, and only 2% of the population of Berlin was Jewish, the lawyers were cut back to 2%. Jewish kids were not allowed to go to German so-called schools, Aryan schools. These laws were devastating. They were so devastating that the president of the Republic, Hindenburg, said, Hitler, this is too much. You've got to scale them back. And so Hitler did. He moved back and he said, all right, we will excuse all veterans from frontline service in the First World War. Because Hindenburg, the general from the First World War and the president, said, you can't dismiss my loyal soldiers. And so they scaled it back. This is another tactic. Announce something drastic and then scale it back. So people will say, it's not as bad as it could have been. The boycott was announced forever, and it was pulled back after a day. It left Jews in a position of not knowing the reality. So this was now the end of democracy. On the 11th of May, in every university town in Germany, all Jewish authors' books, all books by Jewish authors and critics of the Reich were thrown, including Thomas Mann, were thrown onto a bonfire in the center of the university, and the books were burned everywhere. Freedom did not include the freedom to criticize Aryans or the government, or to write critically, or to be Jewish. Now, during this time, Hitler became extremely popular because his foreign policy was successful. He fulfilled the foreign policy demands of all the Democrats before. Oh, sorry, one more insult. Here is, the Jews who left the country were derided as having not enough patriotism. And so they were laughed at. Ha, look at them. They're going, this is Thomas Mann's brother. All the Jews are going to Israel, and they left Thomas Mann's brother back behind. And there says, Izzy, this is your last chance. Look, we're going to be trapped. So everywhere Jews were insulted. Meanwhile, Hitler was brilliantly successful. Let's just go through very quickly the undeniable brilliance of Hitler's foreign policy, calling the bluff of just about everybody. He militarized every one of these actions violated the Treaty of Versailles. He militarized the Rhineland. He had unified with Austria. The dates are up there. He annexed the German-speaking part of Czechoslovakia. He conquered the rest of Czechoslovakia, and the Allies did nothing to stop him. Nothing. He went on. He invaded Poland, and he didn't think they'd do anything there either. That started World War II on the 1st of September 1939. And he went on to conquer France, Belgium, Netherlands, Scandinavia, invaded the Soviet Union in 1941. All of these were successful actions, successful military actions. Even Germans who hated the idea of another war had to admit that he was successful. So now let's look at another aspect of German society under the Nazis, and that is consumer society. We don't think of the Nazis as being consumer-oriented because they spent so much money on the economy, on the military, but in fact, there was Coca-Cola, the most popular soda. The Germans tried to sell something called Afri-Cola, but it didn't work very well. On the lower right is soldiers with a Ford car. And here, Marlene Dietrich, yes, Marlene Dietrich left, but they found another Swedish bombshell, Sarah Leander, to take her place. They expelled all African-German jazz players, all Jewish musicians, of course, but they found their own lookalikes. And they started they had their own jazz. So they replaced the people who they banished. Whoever thinks of Nazi society as the leisure society? 7 million Germans took the first paid vacations of anybody anywhere in the world. The paid vacation was innovated by Nazi Germany. They had leisure trips. They had a specially constructed cruiser, the Wilhelm Gustloff, that didn't have staterooms. It had sort of bunk rooms, dormitory rooms. This was a cruise ship for the average person, the average good Nazi person that went on cruise ships. They, as you know, people could start savings accounts to buy their own Volkswagen. Here was a beer mug. This is a special chair for Heinrich Himmler. Everything was Nazified. Then there was Kraftwerk-Freude, the outings, free concert tickets, blockbuster expositions. Incredible. 33% unemployment in 1933, dropped to zero unemployment by 1936-37. The economy was started. Of course the Nazi regime was popular. And the radio was used. The Nazi regime began to produce radios and sell them for below cost, so that every German family could have a radio in its house. And the radios they produced, big surprise, only got German stations, of course. And so here we are, people are listening to the radio. Now, of course, they're collector's items, and indeed, you can buy replicas in Germany now if you want. The Olympics. The fact that there was an attempted boycott that failed made the Olympics in Berlin seem even more successful. Look at that, the Jews tried to boycott it, but they failed. Here's our Olympics. And like the Chinese Olympics, the Germans went all out. They broadcast the first real-time broadcast of the Olympics around the world. That had never happened before. And of course they did everything to make it a great success. The Germans continued to go to movies. Right away in 1933, Goebbels said, oh, it's great, we'll convert people to our way of thinking using the movies. Ha! He tried 3 movies, they bombed. And he looked, he said, no, let's think about the future, let's copy Hollywood. And so German movies were for leisure until 1938. No German movie even mentioned the question of Jews, and then there were 3 movies about Jews, all of them terrible, but there were only 3. Meanwhile, 600 films per year were licensed for show in Germany. And the Germans keep records of everything, so we know that in 1939 alone, Germany, a country of 65 million people bought 624 million movie tickets. So this was a media-savvy country, for sure. But the Nazis understood that Germans traveled. And so instead of ignoring foreign criticism, they published foreign criticism in their own Nazi periodicals. And so they ridiculed the cartoonists that ridiculed Nazi Germany. So they immunized them in a way against foreign envy. They said, oh, of course they're critical in France, they just envy us. They were extremely savvy. In 1938, 83 international conferences were held in Germany. No professional group ever thought of boycotting Nazi Germany. More exchange students came to the United States and vice versa in 1934 than in 10 years earlier. In every respect, Nazi Germany was accepted into the international community. And there was an artistic revolution. Suddenly, all those decadent artists from the Weimar period that were so corrupt were out of business, and the Nazis recognized traditional painters of healthy art. They gave them a labor union, they gave them benefits, and they bought lots of their art. This particular one I thought you'd like to see was the triptych that was above, Hitler chose for above his residence in Munich. And incidentally, notice it's a kind of updated Renaissance. It's not German art, it's Renaissance for whatever reasons. And looks classical, except, wait a minute, come on, what makes them different? Well, art historians among you will know. Look at the hair, it's 1930s hairstyle for sure. And also, I know you're too shy to say it, look, this pubic hair. Now, normally, in this kind of traditional painting, there's a little drape of some kind, but the Nazis wanted to make modernist, they wanted to make conventional art look modern and daring. And to do that, this is a picture up here is where this picture was hung. This is Hitler's Davenport in his Munich apartment. And to emphasize even more the beauty and the purity of official art, they showed people decadent art. And can you imagine, I come from the States of Jesse Helms. I know he's not a real political presence now, he died, but he was for years the leader against pornography. Can you imagine Jesse Helms taking an artwork that's controversial like Piss Christ or one of the things that he called decadent and exhibiting it in North Carolina? What a strange thing to take decadent art that supposedly has a degenerate effect on its viewers and put it on a huge exposition in Munich, offer people reduced prices on the train to go visit, to stay in the youth hostels. Traveling exhibits went all through Germany, showing Germans the decadence that they were rescued, from which they'd been rescued by the Nazis. This is brilliant marketing, incidentally. And Hitler himself posed as a kind of Christ, I guess. Look, where there usually is a peace dove, there's an eagle. And behind him are flocks and flocks of uniformed SA men. And look at the picture of Hitler, the future. Youth serves the Führer. The Führer replaced the parents as the authority figure. And here on the lower left is a picture of a whole genre of what I would call celebrity journalism. Now, we take this for granted, but in the 1930s it was revolutionary. I mean, we all know Brad and Angelina, who have their public life packaged, their private life packaged for public consumption. And everybody, if you've ever, of course you've never bought these magazines, but if you've ever been at a supermarket checkout line, you've looked at them, the lives of the stars. Hitler manufactured a private life for his followers, and these were a series of very cheaply printed little booklets of Hitler at home. Here he is with his dog Blondie, probably the only female he ever really loved, they said. Although there was his niece who shot herself with his revolver in 1931. But anyway, so these are pictures of Hitler, the ordinary guy. Then there's Hitler, the internationally respected diplomatic leader, to be feared but also respected. And here's the children's prayer. It's like the Lord's Prayer, but it's for kids. So Hitler was all things to all people. And here he is, just an ordinary guy. Flocks and flocks of school kids came to visit Hitler, and they all went home with a picture of their class with Hitler as just a regular kind of guy like everyone else. And this is one of my favorites. Look closely. If you really look, you will see. And now, after that, so this is how the Nazi Party sold the image of Hitler and the image of the party, and it sold a demeaning attitude towards Jews. Now, I'd like to go through quickly a slideshow. Slides in 1930s were as revolutionary as PowerPoint now, maybe even more. And 1,000 sets of slides were circulating at all times through all the Hitler Youth organizations, and the leading guideline for Hitler Youth was Youth Teaches Youth. So 3 sections of this slideshow, 76 slides in all. Section 1 was the healthy Aryans. Section 2 was degenerate, genetically damaged people, Aryans, but degenerate Aryans. The third was Jews. So here we go. This healthy life. And I put the English translation in the old script because the Nazis projected this modern eugenic science, but often with the traditional script. So as again to blend modern science and conventional German wisdom. Okay, healthy life up here. Here we are, marching. Every race law had a corresponding statue, either a medieval statue or a specially commissioned statue. This is the statue that commemorated the law saying that everyone, before they could get a marriage license, had to undergo a genetic examination so they would be guaranteed healthy and fit to become mothers and fathers. And look at how interesting this statue is. Look how similar the male and the female figure are here. They're also quite unusual. Here is the law, the famous, infamous Nuremberg laws that forbade not only marriage, but any kind of sexual contact between Germans with Jewish grandparents and Germans with Christian grandparents. And this was called, always these laws were called protective laws. Every law against a racial minority was called the law to protect against some kind of danger. And this is a very famous medieval statue in the city of Naumburg that gave it a kind of the protection of the German population from Jews. The history of anti-Semitism was made respectable. The pogroms against the Jews were praised as early examples of Jews defending themselves against, Germans defending themselves against the Jews, the Jewish danger. The second part, the second part of the slideshow was the eugenics part. There are, even among Aryans, people who carry diseases, genetic diseases, who should not be allowed to procreate. There were not 8 of them. It's like trying to remember all the 7 dwarfs, but I'll try to remember as many as I can. So some of them were conventionally feeble-mindedness, spina bifida, epilepsy, Down syndrome, not the, tell me, the when you bleed, not hemophilia, but schizophrenia, depression, asocial, very many hard to diagnose diseases. All right, so how do you diagnose somebody who's so depressed they can't have children? Well, you send a social worker into the house, it's usually a woman, and you send her in right after dinner, which is at noon, and the social worker looks around, and I want all of you to think of your dorm rooms, okay, or your rooms back home. If the social worker found that it was messy, you were a target to be investigated, because maybe you were depressed. So normally, you're not supposed to stare at the misbegotten. These slides said to the German youth, stare at these people. Don't feel Christian compassion for them. They are not worthy of compassion. They are outside our moral sphere. And photographs always look real. We don't want like this, always on the left side. We only want like this. Not like this on the left, but like this on the right. We are going to breed a new superior people. The moral status equals the physical appearance. Statistics. The unhealthy, the wrong kind of people, the degenerate people outproduce the healthy people. They're a taxpayer's burden. Students learned how to do mathematical fractions based on the cost-benefit per child of a healthy child or a child that had special needs, as we would say. And so the moral of this section was brought home. Life is a burden. Life without hope. And at the upper right, therefore, God cannot want the sick and the infected genetically to reproduce their sickness and infection. So religion comes into the moral equation. This group of imbeciles is the product of dysgenic marriages. They each suffer from obvious physical and mental defects which make them incapable of living happy, productive lives. They are among the better not born, people who would be better off dead. That is from an American campaign called the Fitter Family Campaign. Every state had, in the fall there are state fairs. Well, there was a Fitter Family contest. And families would compete to be the fittest family, and then there'd be a fittest family in the whole country. And this is part of preemptive self-defense, and this was from the United States. The stars indicate countries and provinces that had eugenic, forced sterilization, and other measures in the 1930s. So Nazi Germany was not alone. The first country to start forced sterilization was the United States. Not all the states, one state at a time. In the end, 20 states, the most progressive states, had forced sterilization. A total of 53,000 people were sterilized in the United States. In Nazi Germany, the general thought is 120,000 people were sterilized, and if you add sterilized with euthanized, in quotes, mercy killing, in quotes, you end up with 400,000. So there's a huge difference in scale, but the idea was the same. Actually, Google Fitter family, and you'll come up with a couple of wonderful, wonderful histories of the Fitter family in the United States, so I won't take time with that. Even ads, this is a lumber state, so I couldn't resist. This is an ad for a chainsaw that says, only the healthy trees that grow native to this place, only healthy trees come from here. We cut away all the horrible undergrowth and we just leave the healthy, which is again a eugenic message, just with forests. Your body does not belong to you, it belongs to your people. You keep your blood pure, it does not belong to you alone. And now we're beginning to move into the Jewish section, section 3. Jews were taken out of Europe and placed in Africa, anthropologically, and in the Middle East. Their pictures were lined up with other non-Europeans so that they were removed from Europe, again, pushing Jews out of the category of human like us. And on the lower left, you'll see some more studies of facial types. This was very popular. And in fact, here, the chairman of the anthropology department for years and years, Ernest A. Houghton, did a long study on the origin of the Jewish nose. And to this day, every 2 years, there's a Houghton Prize offered by the anthropology department. Houghton had the position of Stephen Jay Gould, but 50 years earlier. So that the search for the Jewish stereotype was not limited to Nazi Germany. We just forget about that part of our past. So this is some examples of anthropology. Again, this is packaged as knowledge, not as ideology, not as propaganda, but knowledge. And when they looked for parallels, they looked to the United States Jim Crow laws. And they compared the inhuman, terrible, terrible laws against the African Americans in this country, and they said our campaign against the Jews is far more civilized than the American racism. During the occupation, the French occupation of the Rhineland, because of a treaty violation in 1923-24, the French included some Senegalese soldiers to occupy German territory, and from when they left, 600 German women were pregnant with African German children. Those children, when they could be found, were sterilized by and large. Here they are. Look at how cute the kids look. And the Nazis said, they're bastards on the Rhine, and they should be, though you may look as if you may have sympathy with them, but they must be sterilized, and many of them were killed in concentration camps. More information, criminology. The Jew is criminal, and here are pictures of criminal Jews, so that you think, they're dangerous. This is the crimes they do. And can you read this? It doesn't have a caption. The Jew is an abortionist. Kills fetuses of valuable German stock. Look at all the graveyards in the background. Films. Records. This record was Hitler Speaks, and of course the vinyl records were brand new then, and all the Nazi records were of course brown vinyl. They had brilliant filmmakers. Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will is still a classic. Yud Sus is the first serious anti-Semitic film, and it's based on a novel by a Jewish author of that name, set in the 18th century. And so the Nazis used a Jewish novel as the basis for their first anti-Semitic film. Children read a storybook like this, 1938, where even though the message was, it's called The Poison Mushroom, and if you want to look at some incredible Nazi propaganda and propaganda from the former East Germany. Just Google website and Google propaganda and Calvin, like Calvin College in Michigan, and you'll come to the website. And you'll see this full-color book called, among other things, The Poison Mushroom. The point here was that even when Jews look as if they're harmless, actually they're dangerous. They're dangerous. And the danger, the Jewish danger, was always male. Here he is, a merchant, trying to cheat an innocent peasant girl. And over again, the message is to the kids, your mom and dad tell you to trust the Jews. They're just like everyone else. But your Hitler Youth leader says, don't trust them. Believe the Hitler Youth leader. Don't believe your parents. Your parents are old-fashioned. What do they know? Here's more. This is a popular publication showing that the Jews were guilty, responsible for the terrible British Empire, which, of course, the Germans would have loved to have, but we won't go into that. And here's an example. So here's Disraeli. Here are famous Jewish English people, supposedly. They are the Jews are industrialists. There they are playing golf, also a very decadent sport. Here is another article from a large format magazine like Life magazine with lots and lots of pictures. Here's what the Jews looked like in Vienna in 1938, just after Austria was conquered. And then the film The Eternal Jew was made. A more disgusting, dangerous propaganda film I've never seen. It was brought out in 1939, 1940, and translated into the language of every country where Nazi Germany was occupied. And it was called The Eternal Jew. It was based on a blockbuster exhibition that traveled all around Germany. And once again, it was based on so-called knowledge. It was not called propaganda. It was written like a documentary. In 1938, on November 10th, all over Germany, the SA, Hitler's stormtroopers, attacked Jewish businesses, broke into Jewish homes, savagely beat up the men. 30,000 Jewish males were arrested and taken to concentration camps. It's the first time Jews as Jews were taken to concentration camps. The public opinion was horrified. Glass everywhere, broken, synagogues, nearly every synagogue in Germany was bombed. Terrible, terrible destruction. And this was the first outbreak of nationwide anti-Semitism ever. In March 1933, when Hitler first took over, the random violence against Jews was terrible, but then it was kept down. This provoked outrage in the German population. We're not sure why. We don't know if the average person couldn't understand the destruction of property, or if they didn't think it was just that Jews were being persecuted. It's not really so clear. But everywhere, the mood and morale monitors came back with the idea that this is terribly unpopular. So the picture magazines began to feature these mugshots of the 30,000 men put in concentration camps, and look what you're being protected from. Photographs of businessmen with their heads shaven. I mean, shave every head in this room and you won't look too good either. None of us will. Put on a striped prison uniform and it looks dangerous. So what had happened by then, I think, is best captured by a man who was 6 in 1936. His name was Alphonse Heck, H-E-C-K. He came to this country after the war, and he recounted honestly how deeply he had been a believer in Hitler. In fact, he remembers wanting to commit suicide in 1945 rather than have the Americans occupy his country. He was deeply, deeply committed against his parents' wishes, and he made a special for HBO, which you can I think still find, and look under Alphonse Heck, H-E-C-K, and it's called Heil Hitler. And he also wrote a book. And in it, he tells about the day in 1939 or 1940 when the Gestapo came to his little town in the Rhineland and rounded up all the Jews. And Alphonse Heck looks back and he said, they took my best friend Heinz. And when they took my best friend Heinz and his family, I didn't say to myself, oh, this is an outrage they're taking Heinz and his family just because they're Jewish. I said to myself, oh, isn't it a shame Heinz is Jewish? That's the moral sea change. Isn't it a shame Heinz is Jewish? Because he never doubted, Alphonse Heck never doubted the justice of removing Jews from so-called German life. Let me now go to part 3. And in some ways, anti-Semitism, persecution, and mass murder during wartime are easier to understand than the everyday persecution of 1933 to 39. The boycotting, the quiet boycotting of Nazi businesses, the not speaking to your friends who were Jewish. So let's look at the wartime just very quickly. All soldiers got pictures of the Jews and the inferior, the Untermenschen, in the East. Nazi Germany fought 2 different wars, one against the West, which was relatively civilized as wars go, and the other absolutely brutal and savage in the East. And so the same motifs. This is us, that's them. This is them. This is the people we're fighting against. This is the people we're defending against. The people like us were different from the people not like us. And then last year, 2 years ago, suddenly several photograph albums surfaced that showed the Nazi concentration camp guards at leisure. Until then, people thought, oh, they must have been strange or deprived. And I guess you may have seen the film The Reader, whose only fault was probably that she was illiterate. But here we have the Nazi leader lighting a Christmas tree, and here are a bunch of women guards and a guy playing a harmonica. They're Auschwitz guards. Life was pretty good, between, of course, unpleasant moments. And this, a year ago, from the New Yorker, was an album showing again all those people. This is again the the accordion and the singing choir, the men's singing choir from Auschwitz. And now we have a whole view of the perpetrators that's completely different from the one that was dominant for about 40 years. These were people who saw themselves doing a hard job, but a job that they believed was necessary. They had learned it was necessary. Modern science told them it was necessary. Heinrich Himmler was always concerned that his killers stayed decent. He said, if they don't stay decent, we'll lose control of them. If they begin to commit crimes because they want to, we don't want that. 12,000 German soldiers were executed because they had disobeyed orders. Maybe they had gone AWOL, maybe they had done other things. Did any of them refuse to kill a Jew? No. Not one soldier in Nazi Germany was court-martialed for refusing to follow an order to kill Jews. Sadists, however, were tried and executed. Himmler didn't want sadists. He wanted disciplined men who thought of themselves as decent. And above all, in leadership capacity as the heads of concentration camps, heads of euthanasia centers, he wanted family men who could feel that they still remained respectable despite their unpleasant work. And so this is, I think, the takeaway message, and it's frightening, that in fact Germans believed what they were doing was correct, that the government was the authority. These were state-sanctioned crimes, and they were obedient. And so I'd just like to almost end with an image of what counted for decent. This is the SS marching in Berlin. This is the SS after the massacre at Baba Yar, when 33,000 Jews were killed in a ravine near Kiev. And can you see these SS men in this picture? If you look really closely, here's one, and there's one. And they're walking among the corpses, looking for valuables, having murdered pretty much one-on-one, mass murdered 33,000 people in cold blood, men, women, and children. And so here are the two sides of Nazi respectability. On the one hand, super virtue and righteousness. On the other, I think, utter depravity. And so that's, I think, the warning that we have to heed, is that the Nazi state was not a totalitarian state like Stalin's Russia or Mao's China or Pol Pot's Cambodia. It emerged out of a democracy without a violent revolution or a takeover. The Nazi dictatorship was founded on the institutions and advantages of a collapsed democracy that didn't work. And so I think when we think about resistance, we have to think about watching in our own society for when we hear certain categories of people pushed off the moral scale. And that's when resistance begins, although Dr. Wittgenstein will certainly tell you more than I can about that. And so, in closing, I'd like to quote Susan Sontag, who commented that courage has no moral value in itself, for courage is not in itself a moral value. Vicious scoundrels, murderers, terrorists may be brave. To describe courage as a virtue, we need an adjective. We need to speak of moral courage. And that's, I think, the lesson for Holocaust Memory Week, to combine knowledge, critical knowledge, together with courage. And very few people did, but you're going to hear the day after tomorrow from one quite extraordinary person who did resist at that level. Thank you. Now there's time for questions. Did I do? Yeah, I did it. Just barely. Yes, back there.
Shed a lot of light on how the Nazis did it. But could you talk for a moment about, in your opinion, why they did it?
Why they did what? Killed Jews?
Why they turned anti-Semitism into the murderous force that it was?
First of all, I do not believe that Hitler, when he wrote Mein Kampf, ever imagined engineering the mass murder of Jews. I think that evolved. And remember, the core of the Nazi Party was obsessively filled with hatred, like the Ku Klux Klan member might be. And in wartime, the opportunity presented itself. And there's another issue, and this is very controversial. The Nazis had almost no planning for how they were going to provision their troops in the East. And they realized very, very soon after they failed to get to Moscow in their first winter in the war in 1941 that they had a crisis on their hands. They had food shortages. The Poles did not give up their food. None of the people in occupied areas did. And the Nazis began letting Russian POWs starve to death and murdering them and planning for the deportation of Jews. So it's a combination, I think, of an obsessive racism on their part and a very critical shortage of supplies. Although Albert Speer and the reasonable people in Hitler's entourage argued very, very strongly it was completely irrational to exterminate skilled people, most of whom spoke German, or many of whom spoke German, and this is just the kind of workforce, slave workforce, that Germany needed to win the war. So it was counterproductive. So on the balance, I would have to say that the orders from on top to organize the Auschwitz and the other camps and systematic extermination came from irrational hatred. And why the camps and not the direct killing that Christopher Browning, for example, writes about? I think Himmler won the day. Himmler was terrified that person-to-person killing would gut the insides out of his finest men. We call it post-traumatic stress syndrome. And so I think the mass extermination was designed to industrialize killing and distance the perpetrators from their actions. Yeah.
I don't understand why in Germany, because there's numerous cases where people were demonized, and yet the population, the Western population is not acquiesced, either this country, Muslims, or even during Jim Crow, or civil rights. I don't think I can find out why it succeeded in Germany to the degree it did.
For it being the Holocaust.
Yes.
The Holocaust happened in a time of war, all-out war, and I think war is a solvent for any kind of, because fear is a solvent for. The mass murders did not. The mass murders did not. And in fact, no Jews were arrested and thrown in concentration camps until very late, November 1938. So persecution, yes. But what tipped persecution into extermination was the atmosphere of war. And then there's a debate. Did the plans emerge during the time when Nazis felt they were going to win? Or did the worst killing begin after the invasion of the Soviet Union, or even better, after Pearl Harbor, when it was clear that the Nazis were not going to win? That's a debate, and actually it's an ongoing, there's evidence on both sides. But the situation of all-out total war, when 30,000 people could be killed in a bombing raid over Hamburg in one night, when bombers were flying over, carpet bombing, and the propaganda machine, and this was propaganda, was saying, Germans, the Jews are bombing you. My first German boyfriend was shocked when I told him Roosevelt wasn't Jewish. He said, of course it was Roosevelt, that's Rosenhoft. I mean, it's a Jewish name. Because they all believed that the Jewish conspiracy was civilian bombing. And so imagine what it would be like if we heard an air raid signal now and we all went into the basement and didn't know if we would live. War is different. And remember, the killing happened not in Germany. The killing happened in occupied Poland. And so the bystanders there were Poles who didn't speak the language, who had no relationship to the Germans at all, except maybe hostile. Yeah. Yes.
There's a recent novel of historical fiction out by an author named Jonathan.
Yes. Yes, I've just started reading it.
And it's
This thick.
and I just know if you know of it and if you
Yes.
it touches
Oh, the kindly ones, Jonathan Littell. I thought, when it first came out, a friend of mine in Germany sent me the French version. And I looked at it and I thought, oh my gosh, I can't do this. And so I've been waiting for the English translation. It just came into the library, and I hesitated bringing it, and I said, really heavy. It is extraordinary. It's written by a completely unrepentant SS man who has murders and other sexual, horrible, disgusting crimes. I'm only 50 pages in. But it's repulsive, it's repugnant, and he starts off in the first preface, he says, okay, so let's figure out how bad the damage was. So he totes up the values, 6 million Jews, okay, so many Russians, and so he figured out how many people died in Vietnam, etc., and so he counts how many deaths per minute and per second in the terrible crimes of the 20th century. And you think, oh my God, this is a madman, and he is. He's clearly mad. But the book is terribly, terribly controversial, and if I had waded my way through it, I could tell you more about it, but I recommend everyone to read at least the preface and see if you can stand it. It's only 28 pages, the preface. It's called The Kindly One. Oh, your father?
On page 550, it keeps getting better or worse.
Oh, well, you're the one to tell us about it. The Kindly Ones. It's French, written by an author who was born in the 1960s. He's American, he grew up in France, and the English title is The Kindly Ones. Even though he's an American, he writes in French. And it's a worldwide bestseller. Jonathan Littell. And that is a story that he starts out, he said, anybody in this room, any of you people reading, you would do the same thing. Yeah.
How important do you think the stereotype of the Germans as obeying rules and obeying laws was?
Well, I would say yes, because, for example, the Italians are notoriously anti-authoritarian in their deepest personalities. Having lived in Venice, I would say yes. They're also right now absolutely, horrifyingly, overtly racist. They have literally in Padua, a beautiful university town, they have a ghetto. They lock up everybody with African American appearance behind barbed wire at 10 o'clock at night. They have a curfew. They can't be seen on the streets. They open it up at 6 in the morning. It's really terrible, but the Italians in general just plain disobeyed German orders. And Germans have a bureaucracy, they have a tradition, they trust their bureaucracy, they trusted their government. I think the bureaucracy is really important. And out of the bureaucracy comes obedience. Now, Italian bureaucracy, now there is an oxymoron if there ever was one. And so bureaucracy and obedience, I think, go together. And the other thing that the Nazis were brilliant at is projecting an image of the Gestapo. The Gestapo was a ridiculous organization. It was underfunded. They never had time to go out and find anybody. They depended only on denunciations, neighbor denouncing neighbor. My cow is missing. I think I've always hated that person. I'm going to call them a Nazi. And so, but that's not important. The ratio of Gestapo to the population was ridiculous compared to East Germany, where I think 1 out of every 16 citizens was an informer. But the myth was there. People would disappear. You'd never hear from them. So the myth carried over, the Gestapo is going to get you, because they publicized it in the media. They talked about it. So their fear of the Gestapo was exaggerated. People genuinely thought, and I think soldiers believed, that if they refused to kill a Jew, they would be shot or court-martialed. Never happened, but they believed it would. Yeah.
You talked a little bit about Hitler's modernizing a lot of different things, such as the artwork. And I was just wondering, in reference to the traditional stereotypes of Jews in the propaganda that was used during this time period, were modernizations of the traditional Jewish stereotype, or was enforcement of that more effective?
The traditional stereotypes were bad enough so they worked. And incidentally, there were never caricatures of the disabled Aryans. Jews were caricatured, but you could never caricature somebody with Down syndrome or epilepsy. That was off limits because they were Aryans. Jews were caricatured mercilessly, and they were photographed. Jews were never painted. Photographs looked documentary. They looked real. And people were a little more naive. They didn't have Photoshop. And so they believed that seeing is believing. And they were updated stereotypes, updated technologically by photographs. But the same stereotypes were there. Yeah.
They really believed that there were no Aryan handicapped people?
No, they believed there were Aryan handicapped people, and they sterilized them and they euthanized them. People who were terminally ill, they killed them. Euthanized is too polite a word. because they wanted to get rid of those bad Aryans. They wanted to perfect the Aryans. And in fact, they were saying, in effect, we're hard on our own kind, we can also be hard on them. Look, we don't have a double standard, sort of. Yeah.
Were the countries that signed the Treaty of Versailles, that the Republic loved, were they in a position to do anything about it?
Sure, of course. Hitler, it was ridiculous. Hitler had, a tiny amount of troops invading the Rhineland, but he chose the timing brilliantly. He chose the day of the Sunday of the French national election, when France was between governments. And the French would have been the ones jumping up and down saying, stop that guy. But the French were election, they were between governments, the British never would have cared anyway. And so Hitler did brilliantly when his psychology was needed. He did very badly, thank heavens, when logistics, army supplies, they didn't have an Eisenhower in the military, thank heavens. So, yeah.
Earlier you used the language victims or agents. Is that a realistic measure in an entire population?
I was generalizing about the way we look at the Holocaust, and usually histories of the Holocaust do concentrate on victims, how they responded, how they were oppressed, and the histories until very recently of the perpetrators were these faceless people, almost as if they didn't have agency. And so only in the 90s have we started talking about the agents. And of course you can't talk about the whole people. You could talk about the majority of people. And you're wondering, how do we know what the German people even thought, for heaven's sakes? Well, the Germans keep records. For example, I can tell you how women voted all during the 1920s. What? How do they know did they have exit polls? No. They were curious how men and women would vote, so they gave women white ballots and men gray ballots. They kept track. And in Nazi Germany, a totalitarian country absolutely needs reliable opinion polling. They pioneered opinion polls at the time when ad agencies in this country were doing opinion polls. They had V-people, Vertrauenspersonen, trustees, in every little town and neighborhood all over Germany, and every month they were given a set of questions from Berlin to answer. How are the people responding to this law? How did they respond to the Rhineland? How did they respond to the boycott? And without computers, mind you, they tabulated hundreds of thousands of responses from all over Germany to these questions. How do they react to the shortage of cooking fats? Do they accept margarine instead of butter? The most incredible details we know. How are the Protestants responding compared to the Catholics? So we have to know. That's bureaucracy. So we do know what they thought. And, of course, the socialists were German, too. They were in exile. What did they do? They had monthly reports smuggled out of Germany by their loyal people, compiled in first in Paris and then in Prague. No, first in Prague, then in Paris, called the Sopade, S-O-P-A-D-E. You can still see them on the stacks in a lot of libraries. They're mimeographed, printed out, and the socialists are asking the same questions. How are the Germans responding to the leisure activities? How are they responding to the crackdown on the labor unions? So there we have the socialists, and of course the Nazis were reading all the socialist accounts too, because they had an informer on the inside of the exiled socialists. So we've got a lot of information about how Germans really thought. We probably know better than about Americans at that time, because we only had opinion polls for what people are buying and why. Yeah.
Do you feel that Hitler was the brain behind all of the things going on?
No, I think he was the genius, but he wasn't the brains. In other words, if nobody would take an action in the inner circle that they thought Hitler disapproved of, for sure. Hitler set the timing, Hitler set the goals, Hitler himself personally decided that the Allies were going to attack in Holland and Belgium instead of the beaches of Normandy. Hitler himself micromanaged, would not trust his generals. His generals said, no, they're decoying us. And thank heavens he believed in his own divine right. Actually, as long as Hitler was on the defensive, he was brilliant. When he began to believe his myth that he was infallible, then he began to lose his sense. By then he was also on morphine, he was afraid he was going to die, and he was no longer fully competent. But he still made the decisions. Yeah?
In all this, was there a blinding sense among the German population and among the Jewish population in German conquered territory? The Jews, things look better. The Germans, things aren't as bad.
In which August? In the when? During the war? Yeah.
There didn't seem to be a lot of Jewish resistance. I don't know whether it was.
No, there wasn't. Oh, absolutely not. First of all, most Jews were desperate in the 1930s in Poland, and that's where most of the Jews lived, and that's 10% of the Polish population was Jewish. And here is this foreign government coming in. First they've been occupied by the Soviets, then they're occupied by the Germans, and they're completely blindsided. And they didn't understand what was happening to them. And of course everything was supposedly orderly. That's a myth too. Well, we now have the soldiers' diaries, the pictures, the photograph album. It was disgusting. The German soldiers were brutal beyond belief, although then they preferred also to farm out, to outsource some of the worst work to the people in the Lithuanians, Poles who joined their forces. But no, there was so little Jewish resistance. Jews were so poor. Oh, if you heard Toivi Blatt talk a couple of years ago, you would understand that too, that they just had no potential to resist.
Then on the other hand, the German population, did they know how bad this?
Yes. For years they said they didn't, but they do. We've got their letters home, we've got their photograph albums, trophy photos showing proud German officer making Jew sit and lie, cut off their payas. This is Christopher Browning's book. But after that book came out, all kinds of other albums are coming. This is generation. When grandfather dies, then the albums come out of the attic. And the grandchildren are horrified. And you read the letters home, you see the photographs they sent, you see the careful labels. This was the massacre at Sitomar. This was carefully, just like a photograph album. They were photograph albums. So yes, the German people knew. They may not have known the details, but they knew it was so bad they didn't want to know. So I think there's another category. It's called willful ignorance. One more question. That's so intimidating. And then there are 2 people. Oh my gosh, 4 people. Why do people? Oh, 5, 6, 7, 8 questions popping up all over. What are we going to do? You decide, Kara.
I say over on the left.
Okay. Yeah, the left has been a little more quiet. Okay.
Thank you. I wonder if in modern society, if you saw any current countries or regions that mirrored any of the events that led up to something like the Holocaust.
We'll never see that again, ever, in a Western country. Absolutely not. Unfortunately, we've got a situation in the Eastern Congo where it's chaos, but that's a collapsed state. That's different. And I don't think we'll ever see this phenomenon in Western Europe or North America or advanced industrial states. I think what we have to be careful of in every country is the increasing power given to the executive branch of government, whether it's France, whether it's Britain, whether it's Holland. There is a tendency, especially because when there's a threat of terrorism or fear, for the executive branch to accumulate more power. And that's what I think we need to worry about. Last year, Michael Mukasey was facing the Judiciary Committee. This is October, this is 2007, and he talked about the enemies we fought in the past may have been different from the experience that we're having now, but Now, and he used the term about terror, this is torture, and I think this is very relevant this particular week. When he was talking about torture, he said, quote, "It's a very different kind of person," unquote, who is our enemy now. And I think that's the level at which we need to be alert citizens and critical.